Congratulations to you all for making it through the week to Wednesday and being here at 4 o'clock for what is the first of a three-part series where we're going to use geographic and global perspectives to understand a momentous event that occurred in the space where I think a lot of us inhabit now, and it happened 250 years ago. So before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and advance the slide and read a land acknowledgement because we recognize the indigenous peoples of this continent as rightful stewards of the territory and the resources within it. Moreover, we respect and honor the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional lands. We acknowledge that our presence in the places along the route of the Anza National Historic Trail and throughout the Americas is the result of colonization and displacement. The goal of commemorating and re-examining the story of the Anza colonizing expedition of 1775-76 is to learn more fully about how history has brought changes upon these lands we now share. All right, well, you take in this mural, which actually includes an image of Tongva civil rights leader Toi Purina. I want you to begin thinking about how any journey over land through physical space is also an episode that happens differently for each person involved, and that also has different meanings for every person that learns about it. And as we follow along this expedition, we'll benefit from embracing multiple perspectives. So on October 22nd, 1775, if we were part of the Anza expedition, or if we were considering continuing on, we'd be at the Tubac Presidio near what's current day Tucson, Arizona. And we'd be part of a group of somewhere like between 240 to 300 people who'd be traveling with 1,000 livestock, getting ready to journey 1,200 to 1,800 miles, depending on which journeys we were part of, over rough and barely charted terrain, and through the homelands of indigenous peoples to establish a permanent settlement on the port, or at the port rather, of San Francisco. So just think about how we can both think geographically and historically, and how perspective is going to help us to really gain insights. So I'm sharing right now a chart, an image that shows the 4 domains of global competence. And this is just a reminder and a tool for you to use. The reminder is that curiosity leads to investigation and information, and that recognizing and valuing multiple perspectives leads to understanding. And from an informed position, a person's voice carries further, and the actions an informed and engaged person make alone and in partnership with others are valuable. So that's what the global competence framework helps us to practice and to achieve. And I'm going to refer to that just briefly, but I want you to know that this image and a lot of images that you'll encounter on the slides are hyperlinks that lead you to more resources that I think will be helpful for educators and for students. So the second image on the slide says Anza 250. So that's the historic milestone we're looking at today. And it's a real occasion of practice engaged learning. So there are events happening in communities all along the trail. And along that route, there's many opportunities for students, for teachers, for all kinds of people to get involved in the trail and in the story that's evolving around it. So let's just keep talking for a minute about what it means to focus in on global competency. By drilling deeper into those 4 domains and looking at 4 indicators that, as I mentioned, are points for practice, for reflection, and for growth. And at this point, I'm realizing I'm going to switch. You've probably seen enough of me on camera to realize who I am and what I look like. I'm going to go ahead and switch over so you see the slides specifically and see the images larger. So in the domain of investigating the world, we want to have curiosity. We want to think about what we don't already know and what we might not yet fully understand. And hopefully that's what brought a lot of you to the webinar today. In terms of recognizing perspectives, we want to benefit from examining the perspectives and the influences of other people that aren't ourselves. And that's going to allow us, in terms of communicating ideas, to be more effective, to connect with other people and help them understand what we see in the world and vice versa to understand what they see in the world. So we're going to share ideas and context with diverse audiences, not just people like us. And then we're going to finally, in the take action domain, be able to act and reflect individually and collaboratively. So those are some organizing practices, some competencies that we can carry forward as we're thinking about this topic. Okay. A lot of you probably know I'm a geographer, right? And so when it comes to thinking geographically, one of the things that gets me really excited about the story of the Anza expedition is that there are many elements involved in how this event plays out in space and in relation to the specific human and physical environments found between Orcasitas in present-day Sonora and the peninsula of San Francisco. And of course, the events play out across hundreds and thousands of miles. But what we're going to see, I think, in examining the story is that geographic information, not just geography as it exists, but geography as we know about it, plays a vital role at every step. So this slide refers to the Geography for Life standards. And these are the 6 essential elements. And as I mentioned, we're going to touch upon each one of those. And I've just pulled out some vocabulary, some concepts that are going to come up. But that's a lot of words on that page. So let's just zoom in, or rather zoom out, to some really broad questions. So geographers often like to use this 3-part question: where, why there, and why care, or so what. And so if we apply those to Anza National Historic Trail, we're going to ask, where is the trail? We're going to want to locate it as a space that's both real and contemplated or imagined. We're going to understand why it's there by placing it in both geographic and historic contexts. And then we're going to think, what does that have to do with us? And explore what the trail means to different people and how it continues to shape our world. And to do all of this, we're going to need sources, right? So let's talk about what kinds of sources we have. So we can see the trail now as a line on a map. And that helps us visualize how this land that it cuts across was on the frontier of a sprawling Spanish Empire. And I'll highlight here the little inset map. Let me see if I can use my zoom tools. Over here in this area of the illustration, showing you how the Spanish Empire is spread out across the Americas. Predominantly on the west side of South America, the Isthmus of Central America, and much of Western North America. On this map, the key is just a little bit cut off, but you're seeing the whole route of the Anza expedition, including this dotted line, which is a route that along which participants, settlers, were recruited. And then the solid red line leaving San Miguel de Orcasitas and ending up way up here in what's labeled as San Francisco, but was not known as San Francisco at the time. So here, if we're kind of referencing our present day and time, we're going to be right here at San Ignacio de Tubac. See, there's a 7-day stretch from October 15th to 22nd, 1775. But that's just one trail, right? And it's marked and it's mapped because of its significance historically. So the trail that the Anza expedition followed is now 250 years later recognized as one of the United States National Historic Trails. I grabbed this image off of a website to show that it is in fact a system. It's now 21 routes across 43 states. And whoops, my little outline image didn't go away. We'll have to figure out how to do that. And the issue here is not just that the number of trails and the number of routes, but that there are reasons for commemorating, reasons why we designate these as historical routes of national significance. They are routes along which exploration, trade, displacement, conflict, military action, and migration occurred. Look at that. I figured out how to erase the line. Okay, so these are designated by Congress. They're for our public heritage, so they belong to us. They show a diversity in our American heritage. And if you read the description of this webinar, you know that's one of the reasons that I thought Anza 250 was a particularly relevant piece of how we might look at America 250. And in fact, on this slide, you'll see a link to an updated interactive map, which will show you not only all 21 National Historic Trails, but also the National Scenic Trails, like the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, that you could travel along. Now, it's not just a line on a map that's approximating where the expedition has gone. There's actually a route that's tracked and known in considerable detail as a result of careful documentation and research. It's like a string of pearls consisting of 106 campsites that are, in most cases, pretty well understood in terms of the location where they are. On this map, you see the term fixed points. And you also see that some are hypothesized points. These are points where physical evidence and written records suggest the location might be right, but there's not a confirmation. And it's more than just a line, it's actually a corridor. Think about 240 people, 1,000 animals moving across space. They take up some width. And so the amount of grazing, the amount of kind of the spread out of that group of bodies moving through space means that it's a corridor. In fact, one of the connections that I've had with Anza National Historic Trail is helping to update that map. And it's really kind of interesting to see in which the ways in which the National Park Service works with citizen historians. The guy in the center receiving the award here is named Phil Valdez. He referred to himself as an Anzaholic because he just was dedicated to studying and retracing the events of the Anza expeditions. We'll talk about the fact that there's two. And on the far right is a young man named Emmanuel Delgado, who is a graduate student in the geography department of San Diego State University, who had some GIS skills and was able to work with Phil to take the knowledge that he had acquired and translate it into a digital realm to actually update the map. Um, the data that Phil studies is not just evidence on the ground, it's written diaries kept by 3 leaders. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to switch us over to the story map that I created, which is going to serve as a resource throughout the series of webinars. So I'm going to pull that story map up again, and you should see an image of Anza. Let me double check that you're seeing what I think you're seeing. Yep. Okay. So this story map condenses a lot of the information and the resources we're going to be talking about, but also know that the slides are going to give you even more. If you scroll down on a story map, this one or anyone, you're likely to see some headings, some chapters. And I'm going to bounce around a little bit in this one as we go through the webinar today. I'm going to go to the journey recorded because I just want to highlight the fact that there is within this story map a record of each day of the expedition. Each one of the 106 campsites is located to the best of our ability. And within those stops along the trail, the entries made by the three diarists, who are leaders of the expedition that we'll talk about more in a few minutes. You can follow along what those diaries say for the specific days. So the diaries actually begin uh, almost a month ago because the expedition was gathering supplies, gathering participants down in Mexico. I'm going to advance to today. So this is the entry that one of the diarists, Pedro Font, made. Uh, he's actually the one who's credited with the best and most accurate information because he had the skills of a geographer for 1775. You'll learn more about that as we go along. And so they had spent 7 days at Tubac preparing and gathering supplies for the journey ahead. And on the 15th, Font wrote, "We set out from Las Lagunas at 8 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon arrived in the Presidio of Tubac, having traveled some 8 leagues to the north." Typical entries: time of departure, time of arrival, distance that you believe you traveled, direction, things like that. October 16th, we remained at Tubac for some days, I in the mission of Tumacacori, 1 league south of the Presidio, in order to make the necessary preparations for continuing the journey and to assemble the people who were to go on the expedition. Then for 4 days, he basically says same thing, nothing new to see here. October 21st, he talks about a meeting with another member of the clergy, Father Francisco Garces, who, along with his companion, are also going to be joining the expedition. And then he at the end says, "I observed the latitude of this Presidio, but was not satisfied with the observation as the day was overcast. Now, down to October 22nd, the Mass was sung for the success of the expedition. As the day was clear, I again observed the latitude and found this Presidio to be in 31 degrees 43 minutes. So I say, in the Presidio of Tubac, October 22nd, 1775, meridian altitude of the lower limb of the sun, 46 degrees 50 minutes." So he's making a very precise, scientific for that day observation. What you're actually seeing in real time in this diary is the mapping of a new, relatively unknown frontier. And that's a big part of why Font is selected to go on this expedition. Now let's switch over to Juan Bautista de Anza. Now, because we're calling it the Anza Trail and the Anza Expedition, this is the big boss of the group, right? Let's see what he says for October 22nd. He had no entry. October 23rd, this is the official story coming from Anza. "All the foregoing have been arranged and noted, Mass having been chanted with all the solemnity possible on the Sunday preceding, for the purpose of invoking the divine aid in this expedition, all its members being present, and the Most Holy Virgin of Guadalupe, under the advocation of her Immaculate Conception, the Prince Señor San Miguel, and San Francisco de Assis, having been named as its protectors, at 11 today the march was begun toward the north. Making some minor turns to the northeast, and having traveled 4 hours as many leagues, we halted at the place which they called La Canoa, situated on the river of the Tubac. Here, during most of the year, water is found, although it is not running, but by a little digging in the sand, enough can be had for whatever may be required." So a little bit of a window ahead for water availability issues. "At the end of the afternoon today, the wife of one of the soldiers of the expedition began to feel the first pains of childbirth. We aided her immediately with the shelter of a field tent and other things useful in the case and obtainable on the road. And she successfully gave birth to a very lusty boy at 9 o'clock at night, the rest of which was passed without any other happening." That's the official story for October 23rd. Oh, let's check back with Pedro Font on October 23rd. Um, just just this last sentence here, just to be quick. "This night, the wife of a soldier was delivered. She died in childbirth, and the next day was taken to the mission of San Xavier del Bac for burial." De Anza said, "The rest of the night which passed without any other happening." So sometimes the official source is not necessarily giving you the details you need to understand what's actually happening on the ground. Okay, so we're going to dig back into the story map some more, and there's the resources that are in it. That's just one of the resources that's embedded in this story map. We're going to keep going back to it. Let's get to the slides again now. Okay, so we checked out some camp diaries, and we know that we're going to be able to follow together the expedition. If we wanted to, each day between now and March 26th, you could check the diary and see what's being noted by the three leaders. You can see how the expedition is moving through the landscape quite specifically in terms of from campsite to campsite. And you can think about the physical geographic features that are having to be overcome. And you can also think about the interactions that might be happening between the indigenous inhabitants of these lands and these newcomers in what's relatively a small pack struggling against the elements to get to a destination they don't really know anything about yet. Okay, well, if we're going to ask this question about where exactly is the Anza Trail and start to think about why is it there, we're going to have to understand some imperial thinking, right? So a question we might ask is, why, exactly why, and how do you build an empire? And this map that I have here gives you some clues. These arrows, these squiggly lines are explorations into North America specifically, color-coded by virtue of the national origin of the expedition. Whether we're talking about Vikings coming in from the Northeast to the Northeast extreme of North America, whether we're looking at the Dutch, the English, or the French. These are all countries that are competing to get a foothold in the Americas, to expand colonial empires, and to enrich the countries that exist back in Europe. So one of the things you'll notice if you look at the dashed black line here, these are Spanish expeditions. And it might look like the French and the Spanish are both doing overland expeditions, but in fact, the French are specializing in traveling along rivers. And the Spanish are doing something unique on the continent, which is covering overland territory. And so that's going to become important. But let's just carry on thinking about why and how you build an empire. So there's this traditional answer that you'll find if you look into this, which is that it involves three G's. So the first one of the Y's is a religious motivation. This idea that you're spreading a religion and a way of honoring the God that you believe in. We often think of this as kind of a intercultural human contact event in which one person imposes their will on another person to convert them, to require them, or to encourage or convince them to identify with a religious point of view. I want to also point out when we think about what this means for people to be motivated in building an empire by serving a religious goal, that there's an infrastructure to that. On the right-hand side of the slide right there, you see one of the oldest pieces of religious infrastructure that Europeans built in the North Americas. That's a chapel of San Miguel that was built in what we now consider New Mexico in 1610. It's not just the physical building and the effort that goes into constructing it. That building itself represents a reorganization of space with agricultural fields, with territories assigned to that building that serve the purposes of the people that have come to inhabit, both construct and inhabit that building. So that's our first G right there, explaining a why. The second one you often hear is about gold. So gold and the pursuit of wealth was always a big motivator in the expansion of empire. And it also led directly to lots of conflicts. The image on the screen is entitled The Capture of Atahualpa in Cajamarca, and it represents the falling of the Inca Empire in 1532. And you can find many images produced representing Pizarro and the search for the Incan treasures, the gold treasures. They're often represented as gold already mined, gold already formed into possessions and keepsakes. But in fact, again, there's infrastructure, there's a physical geographic footprint to the ways in which a conquering, colonizing force seeks to extract resources, whether we're talking about minerals like gold or other resources like timber or animals. These are pursuits that generate a reorganization and a direct impact into the lands that are being explored and then colonized. And then the third G in this three-part explanation is glory. And this basically translates to the reality that big egos produce high stakes. This is known as the Armada portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And the reason it's called the Armada portrait is the scenes behind her represent what happens if you mess with the power of England on the high seas. The Spanish Armada did not fare well against the might of the English Navy, and the spoils for that victory are being displayed on and about the Queen. Note not only her jewels and the crown to her side, but the fact that her hand is upon the globe, expressing not only her control, but her desire for expansive territorial acquisition. So these images give us a little bit of a way of interpreting the why, right? What is it that motivates the pursuit of empire? But then if we ask this how question, we might want to go back to this map because it starts us along the line of questioning of what were these explorers doing? What were they looking for? And what they were really doing and what they were looking for was they were trying to trigger a set of events where they would identify resources, identify territory that could be claimed, territory that had not yet been taken over by another European power, that where it would necessitate a fight that was especially valuable. This kind of unclaimed, maybe with indigenous inhabitants, but from the point of view of European explorers, open to conquest. And so these explorers were bringing back information. They were bringing back information about what exactly was out there for these empires to acquire. And it was a competitive environment. So this is a depiction from an OER project assignment or a learning activity that's available to you, just showing how Spain, Portugal, France, the UK, Russia, and the Dutch were all competing for a foothold in the Americas. And if you look at the corner of this map up here, you'll see some gray territory that's essentially unclaimed. And so the Spanish, the French, the Russians, the British, they all have territorial claims that border on this unclaimed territory. So this is where empire becomes very sensitive to competition. So let's think about this for a minute, and let's reference a map from back in the day, because if we look at that map before, it makes it seem like we know exactly where North America is. And I think if we look at this map, again, I'm going to exit out of slide sharing here and reference the page on David Rumsey's map library where I found this map. I'm going to zoom in here and take a look at what this map shows. First of all, you're going to see the routes of lots of different ships, explorations, charting the territory. And then the lines on the map are going to show you what exactly has been charted. So here labeled as California is actually the Baja Peninsula. You'll see New Mexico labeled here with the Rocky Mountains more or less accurately identified. You'll see the coast, the Pacific coast extending up. This river of the West would be the Columbia. And then this, we're getting up to Vancouver around this area. And what happens is all sort of detail, all kind of specificity drops off, first of all. No idea what's going on up here towards Alaska. But also, what's this label? New Albion, so named by Francis Drake, to whom the country was surrendered by the king in 1578. That's an English name. So while we see Mexico or New Spain labeled here, and we see the yellow color tracing that off, we also see a contestation of space reflected in this map. And that contestation is happening right in the area where geographic knowledge is dropping off precipitously. The map simply doesn't have the detail, which proves that there really isn't enough information, enough occupation to make a solid claim. So, this competition for space that's happening among European powers is one that depends on getting information and acting upon that information. So we've got the three whys, and I won't even debate what the relative significance of those is. I think they tend to feed into, one feeds into the, or two feed into the other one. But what I will mention is that what you need to build an empire is territory, and the costs of acquiring territory are significant. Those exploratory expeditions cost money, then actually occupying the territory costs even more money. You have to secure it with forts, missions, members of a military who are trained and willing to serve an empire. And then, in order to get any return on all of that cost that goes into acquiring the territory, you need to develop that land. You need to generate enough occupation, put enough people in place as workers to exploit the resources that are available and make a profit for the empire that has gone to all the trouble of acquiring the territory. All right, I'm going to pause for a minute and see if there's any questions in the Q&A. There are not. Also checking chat. Reposting. Okay. I know it's because it's a webinar format, but this is quiet. I'm gonna carry on. I want to make sure that we know that there's lots of things that you're going to be introduced to in this 90-minute session that are going to require some further exploration, some investigation on your part to make full value of. My goal here, not just with the story map, but the assemblage of other sources and perspectives, is to help equip teachers at all kinds of levels. Whether I mentioned in the flyer for the program, I think this material begins to be very relevant in fourth grade and fifth grade. It's highly relevant for the eighth grade curriculum, but it's also really useful in thinking about the premises of ethnic studies and the balances, especially as we get to thinking about who's involved in this expedition, around how people participate in shaping society, participate in shaping a shared future. Okay, I see chat is disabled. That's probably a webinar feature. So thanks for letting me know that, Jem. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A and I'll keep checking back there. Thank you very much for letting me know. It's been a pair of Zoom updates since I've last done this, so I was hoping I would be able to navigate all the functions. Okay, well, let's take a look at this source text. This is one of several publications from Heyday Books in the Bay Area. They've been really gracious with me. I've reached out to them because some of these materials are out of stock, out of print rather, and I wanted to make sure I had their permission to share copies with you, and they were enthusiastically supportive. This particular element that I'm sharing right now is available online. So there's a link right here um, to get a sense of what exactly this first chapter of our webinar has been about. So the particular excerpt I pulled out was subtitled Spain's Geopolitical Agenda and the Settlement of California. And this is a kind of a summary of what we've addressed so far in the webinar, but also a way of just kind of tilting perspective again, thinking about what the story might look like, what the entry points into the story might be if you were taking a indigenous California native perspective. So by the 1760s, Spain had been colonizing in most of South and Central America, the Baja California Peninsula, and northern Mexico, including what is now the US Southwest, for almost 250 years. So we're talking about something 250 years ago that was really 250 years into the Spanish colonial experience. Like all of the European imperial powers, the Spanish believed they had the God-given right to claim land for Christ and the king if it was not already claimed by a stronger power, regardless of who was living there. Missionaries moved up the Pacific coast into Alta California, present-day California, founding a mission in San Diego in 1769 and continuing north, establishing missions for the next 54 years. The early missions hugged the coast, battling the refractory winds that sometimes blew ships halfway to Hawaii, and were protected only by the handful of mission station soldiers and by the two presidios, San Diego and Monterey, that were located dozens or even hundreds of miles away. The missions received supplies from Mexico, but the Spanish crown was eager for them to become self-supporting. It also wanted to establish civilian settlements that could hold the land against the expanding English colonies to the east and the Russian settlements farther north of the Pacific coast. But the coming colonists, first and foremost, needed a land route from New Spain to Northern California. That was what the Anza expedition was about. The Spanish brought their Christianizing missions and geopolitical ambitions to a California where an estimated 300,000 people already lived in dynamic, complex relationships with the land and with each other and hundreds of small tribes, each with its own language and creation story, each managing its lands and daily life. By the time of the Anza expeditions, Spanish presence in the area was no secret. Coronado had explored the southwest as early as 1524, and Spanish ships had navigated the coast since Cabrillo sailed in 1542. News of the men with beards, leather armor, muskets, and horses was certain to have traveled between tribes and along the trails. The missions, presidios, and settlements of New Spain were already becoming part of the landscape where native people lived. Okay, that brings kind of a good summary to that section of the presentation about how and why empires are built. Now, I'm seeing Jim's question on the Q&A about what about Russian maps? And I think every one of those empires that would have been represented on this map, oops, just going back, right? The same question could be asked, what about the Portuguese maps? What about the British and versus French maps, the Dutch maps? And I think that's an excellent way to understand different imperial perspectives. There wasn't just one imperial perspective. For example, the Portuguese and Spanish had negotiated access to different parts of the Americas through the Treaty of Tordesillas very early on. But not every imperial power was playing nice with the others that were neighboring. So think about the friction between the French and the British that was actually part of the precipitator for the American Revolution at exactly the same time. So what I would recommend for that, and I don't have any immediately accessible, but this platform I was on, showing you this map right here, David Rumsey Map Collection. This is an amazing collection, and you could look for maps of North America that were produced in Russia. Notice how this map here has a fairly complete bibliographic entry. And so you can find where this map was produced, who produced it. And so you can filter through here and find maps of North America produced in Russia or in other locations. So great question, and hopefully this is a great source. There are other sources of maps, but David Rumsey Map Collection is one of my favorite and my kind of go-tos. So you've already got a link in the slides there, and we're going to look at another map from the Rumsey collection later. Okay, what I have in the story map that I want to point out so far is some maps from our California Atlas. So this atlas is designed to align with fourth grade standards, and it includes some interesting maps that make for some interesting juxtapositions that can really help guide an inquiry into multiple factors and help students understand how California developed over time with input from a lot of people. For example, here you see a map of, let me put it back in slideshow mode, a map of Native American territories in California in 1770, more or less the environment into which the Anza expedition is entering. Here you see a map that has a lot of, it looks like spaghetti dropped onto the map of California, but these are the various expeditions, including the Anza expedition, which is this blue line here, cutting across the desert up along the coast, following closely at this point the route of Portola from Mission San Gabriel up to Monterey, but then continuing on to look at possible locations for a settlement in the East Bay as well as in as the peninsula of San Francisco. So there are opportunities to look at these maps and think about how these explorations, how these European forays into this space actually generated contact with some Native American nations and not with others. At the same time, here on the third map from the left is looking at the natural environment, the hydrology before, it says before human settlement. This is really before European settlement. And the fact that the expedition was encountering conditions that are not exactly what we see out on the landscape now. Human use of the lands has changed the environmental configuration. So this hydrology that's shown on this map is what Anza would have encountered, but not so much what we see now. So there's a link to a worksheet here that students could use to investigate these three maps to get some insights into what exploration and early settlement actually looked like in California. So I see Barbara is asking a question about, is there a narrative of the expedition from the clergy point of view? So, and I don't know who Bartolome de las Casas is, but I think you're hitting on a theme there, which is that was actually one of the roles of clergy on expeditions. So in fact, the question is not, is there a clergy point of view, but is there a non-clergy point of view? So two of the three diarists that are referred to in that map that I used earlier, they are actually members of the Franciscan Order of the Catholic Church. So their first job is missionary, second job is as documentarian, geographer, mathematician, analyzer of the local environment. And even somebody like De Anza himself would have been a highly religious person, and his presentation of facts around the expedition would have been tinged with a bit of religiosity, I would dare say. Okay, great questions. We will continue on. I trust that you might be clicking through on the story map and looking at things on your own. And I hope I'm not overwhelming folks with too much information and talking. But as we get to the second and third portion of the program in January and March, you will have had an opportunity to explore a lot more of these resources and sources, and we're not done seeing them yet. And so I hope there'll be a lot more discussion, a lot more conversation. Okay, so now let's think about this question, another question that we can use to organize our thinking. What's it going to take to settle a frontier? If we're planning that expedition back in Tubac and we're trying to figure out what do we got to take on this trip and what's going to make it successful, what do we know about that? So, first of all, we're going to need resources to mount and lead an expedition. The kind of expedition we're talking about is only possible if you are an empire that has reserves, that has the capacity to send people, to send military officers, to send support material to far-flung parts of the globe. This is 1775, the age of sail, walking, and mules. There's no easy way to get people moved around the earth to carry out this expansion of empire. So to get the resources to mount and lead an expedition is going to be considerable. The second thing is you can have a lot of resources, but you still need to know how to travel over this challenging terrain. This is a unique and very difficult environment. It's going to require a lot of geographic knowledge, but also survival skills to make this possible. The other thing is we need some people, right? There's no settlement unless you've got settlers. So there needs to be some people who see this expedition as a calculated risk worth taking. So we're going to need the material resources and the legal authority to mount this expedition. We're going to need the local knowledge and the survival skills, and we're going to need these human participants who are going to add the labor, actually do the migration that the Spanish king is hoping will happen. And yes, Jim, that is Tulare Lake that you see on the map of hydrology before settlement. And you might have seen just driving over to it in the last few years when it refilled up. Dynamic environment. Geography tells us that history didn't take place on a two-dimensional static map. It took place in a place that was challenging, that was dynamic, and was only partially known. Right? So that's why geographic information is a pivotal thing. We can't just look at the map and say, ah, that's where they were. They didn't know that's where they were. We know that now. So let's talk about the leaders of this expedition and where the skill and knowledge and resources are going to be concentrated. So on one hand, we have the leader, Juan Bautista de Anza, who's a Spanish military officer. He's actually the son of a Spanish military officer who was born in Basque countries of Basque cultural heritage. But Juan Bautista de Anza II, the one who's pictured here in a National Park Service illustration, he was born in the colonies. Um, that makes him something called a criollo, which is a person who's born in New Spain. That is already a status marker because it is a person who is a criollo is not the same status as a person who was actually born on the land that is known as the Kingdom of Spain. So De Anza was an ambitious person, and it was actually him that petitioned the government, the governor of Sonora, and then the King of Spain to approve and support this mission in the interest of the empire, but through the ingenuity and the leadership of De Anza to actually create this securing of the Spanish frontier. On the right-hand side of the picture, in a portrayal painted sometime after his death, we have Francisco Garces. Garces is a Franciscan priest, so this is that clergy perspective that is going to be well represented in the diaries. But Garces isn't just a religious figure. Something of a like if you combine Bear Grylls and a missionary, because Garces has been out independently living on the land amongst the indigenous peoples of this region since 1771. So he's got years of experience out in the field that is going to be very useful to to Anza's mission. So this is part of the human capital that's being gathered, along with the financial capital that King Carlos III can offer. Those Spanish servants of the Spanish crown aren't going to get this job done on their own. Is the basic reality, and it's not a judgment. They knew it themselves, and they sought to access local indigenous knowledge in order to achieve a successful expedition. And that indigenous knowledge was key to success. So before Anza ever endeavored to take settlers out to the coast of California by land, he went on an exploratory expedition to determine the route. And on that expedition, he connected with two indigenous individuals who would be extremely important to the success of the expedition. Salvador Palma was a chief, and he was one of the first points of contact. He was in communication with the Presidio at Tubac and the mission in that area. And the Spanish were able to connect Anza with him, and he assisted Anza in the fairly dangerous Colorado River crossing, assuring his safety during the original expedition in 1774. Palma also made a connection between Anza and a man named Sebastian Tarabal. Tarabal was a member of a tribe that resided in Baja, California. And he had moved to the mission San Gabriel at some point and then fled there, was a runaway who knew it was important to get far away from the mission San Gabriel to avoid being punished for his fleeing. So actually, he's on his way to Sonora when he crosses paths with Anza. Anza convinces him to be a guide. And the reason is because what Tarabal has just done in reverse is exactly what Anza is seeking to do. He's come across the Colorado desert and not died. And that's extraordinarily important if you're going to be a Spanish military leader trying to seek glory and serve the interest of God and country with this expedition. Very important. So this is the indigenous knowledge that comes along with the Anza expedition, and the illustrations that you see, even the marker for the trail, represent Anza on horseback with indigenous guides by his side, showing him where to go and how to get through the environment. And then one more person who I already mentioned is another priest. So another person important to the expedition is Pedro Font. Again, he's got the blessing, so to speak, of the Catholic Church, the Franciscan order, but he's also got the skill set that makes him useful in an expedition. He can take sightings and measure latitude. He can produce a map, and in fact, what you're seeing on the screen is the map he produced after the expedition. Notice that it really only accounts for land very close to the coast and directly along the trail because everything inland of there was still unknown. So part of the expedition was charting the territory, not just inhabiting it. It's like building the plane while you're flying it. Okay, let's look at one more map from the David Rumsey collection to think more about what's happening in terms of the expansion of empire. So this is a map from 1885, but it's about, the title is essentially the Kingdom of New Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. So in 1800, this is a depiction of the situation. And now this is with hindsight of 85 years, right? So the map is much more accurate and includes many more features. But we'll see there's still a lot of blank a lot of blank territory. All of the colored areas is part of New Spain that's been integrated into political territories. It's been organized. So most of it is what's called intendencias, which is like a state. And then there are some provinces that aren't yet part of a state. Those provinces would include Vieja California, or what we call Baja California, and Alta or Nueva California, this coastal strip from more or less San Diego up to Oregon. So this is interesting in that the distinction between the colors and the gray tells you something about the kind of intensity or the presence of Spanish occupation at all. There is this frontier push up into New Mexico around Santa Fe. This is, I would say, the footprint of gold fever, looking for the city of gold. But we can also see in this map, this is Tubac right here on the edge of the organized territory, looking out into this vast, disorganized, unsettled territory that Spain is seeking to incorporate and to develop and to exploit. Down here in the corner is a graph. The graph shows population, which is the blue bars, and land area, which is the red bars. And if you follow, I won't expect you to be able, I'm not going to click over to the website right now, which allows you, well, okay, I am. I lied. Because you really do want to see the map in its original glory with all of these illustrations of leaders. But also you should see that on this platform, David Rumsey's map library, the actual documents are scanned with incredible detail. So you can see that the graph in Spanish is labeled the number of inhabitants and the number of square kilometers. And you can see that these last two graphs down here are for Baja California and Alta California, or Old and New California. And they have lots of land, but comparatively or relatively large amounts of land and very small amounts of people, right? This province of California is actually underreporting because zoom out and look, it's really just the coastal strip that's being accounted for. But what Spain is trying to do is trying to push some of the people from these red bars here out to the edge. I mean, from these large blue bars, rather, out to the edge here where the blue bars aren't as high as the red bars. So they're trying to redistribute population within the colonial footprint that they have to essentially secure it against the challenge of other imperial powers and to advance the exploitation and the profiting from the resources that are there. Okay, so that's another map from the amazing David Rumsey map library, which be careful because you could easily lose half a day there, and it's not even a real place. It's an online map library. Okay, so let's go back to thinking about this expedition, right? Because so far we've been kind of thinking about it as a line in space. It's a route that's cutting through indigenous territories. It's cutting through this outer reaches, the kind of known atmosphere of the Spanish imperial territory to find new places and new wealth to add to the glory of Spain. But ultimately, it's a bunch of people walking a really long way on a trail that they're not sure is always going to be easy to find. So that's quite an adventure, right? And that, as we get to the last part of our webinar today, I'm kind of giving a preview of what the content of the second session is going to really dive into much more deeply. So if you are in New Spain, you are not necessarily feeling like you're living on the frontier. You're not necessarily feeling like you're at the edge of civilization because, as was mentioned earlier, there's been 250 years of Spanish occupation. There's been a lot of wealth produced, a lot of status gained by people who've done service to the crown, and there's a lot of comfort for those people who are living close to the core of the New Spain territory. Let me check the questions here before we go on. So Jim's question, I think, is specifically about the last map. So let me go back to this. These lines here, I think you're asking about the actual territorial boundaries, would have been essentially reflecting, now whether this particular cartographer got checked off by the Spanish Empire, because remember, they're producing this in Mexico in 1885, but I think the intent was to reflect the political organization that was being imposed on the land by the Spanish government at the time. So essentially, this was the political organization that the Spanish government was using to administer this new territory. And by administer, I mean just like we've learned about in the 13 colonies, British colonies on the Atlantic coast, there is a process by which the authority of the national government, the imperial government, whether it's Spain or England, is granting authority on behalf of that king or queen to administer territory and produce some activity, some new economy in that place that's going to enrich the empire as a whole. So there's a process underway in every single empire, which is essentially putting the land to work, which means assigning somebody to supervise its working, whether that's the extraction of resources or the development of agriculture, or the training and control of the laborers who were the indigenous or imported slave labor force. So this is really just the reflection, and so there's always a data checking function. But now your next question, Jim, is right on point with where we're going, which were there incentives offered to encourage folks? Well, yeah, we have to think there's going to need to be incentives. So yes, so I'm now looking at your latest question about watersheds or topography. Were they arbitrary? Probably mostly they were using physical barriers to try and identify some naturally occurring ways of organizing the territory. Watersheds, mountain ranges, things like that would have probably been very important. But in some cases, like that northern boundary of Vieja California right there, probably also arbitrary in some cases. That's how political boundaries are. They're all of the above. Whatever makes sense to draw a line that people can understand. Okay, let's see. I think I'm kind of on time with what I wanted to share here. Let me see if I'm caught up on questions. It seems like I am. Okay, so let's talk about this issue of what would the incentive be? Who would actually pick this up? Because I know that a lot of people think that moving to California is a dream, right? And that's been a thing over more than 150 years of the American history of California. But in fact, at the time of the Anza expedition, we were talking about going to a place that did not sound desirable. It did not have any certainty, and it probably had a lot of danger that you could avoid just by staying put where you were. So when we think about who went on the expedition, we can look at it, we can say, so like 240 colonists took this opportunity. They were accompanied by 30 soldiers who were essentially on assignment. They were paid to protect this expedition and assure that they could make this journey to the intended destination. The soldiers were allowed to bring their wives and children, and so there was actually a large group of people traveling, including colonists and essentially representatives of the government. Now, these colonists, it turns out, when we think about European colonization of what were essentially indigenous spaces, we think about white-skinned Europeans intervening in an indigenous place. And in fact, that's not the way it actually looks on the ground. So the colonists who were making this migration, that were moving from Sonora and from the Tubac region out into the unknown reaches of California, were an ethnically diverse mix of people, Native Americans, Europeans, African heritage mixed together. So that's part of what's really maybe surprising and important about the Anza colonizing expedition. The people who did the colonizing on behalf of the Spanish Empire were actually not so Spanish, not so European themselves. Why they were joining this opportunity is because they were experiencing disadvantage, identity-based disadvantage in the in Mexico or New Spain at the time. There was a caste system that was based largely on racial categorization. And so there was an opportunity by doing the work of the Spanish crown to become more Spanish and for your racial identity to become less consequential. So settlers who were baptized, who learned Spanish, and who joined the expedition would have a transformational experience in terms of their caste system. Um, there was also a lot of young people. I mentioned a lot of children traveling with the soldiers, but a lot of the settlers themselves were very young or families with lots of children. There were actually 8 pregnant women that started the journey. You already heard about one didn't make it far past Tubac before giving birth and not making it further herself. There was also a lot of technical support. So there was people that were responsible for moving animals and material along the way. So they're vaqueros, they're muleteers, they're servants to the representatives of the Spanish government, and there's the guides who we've already talked about. Um, we talked about these folks, Batista de Anza, Font, and the livestock. So here's an example of illustration, a piece of art that represents 16 of the castas, the racial groupings that were in place in New Spain at the time of the Anza expedition. And what this caste system did essentially was restrict the social mobility and the status of people of non-Spanish heritage and privilege people of Spanish heritage, but with a gender twist. So it was also male centric, so that Spanish men could bestow their status upon the women that they choose to marry, but Spanish women, the few that were making it to the New World or the few that were being born to Spanish families in the colonies, could not similarly cross racial boundaries and carry their status with them. It would be the male and a parent that would dictate the status. So mixed race marriages were common, but they were also graded according to these castas and given hierarchical privilege and status. So this is an important element of understanding that what's the motivation. The folks in the disadvantaged strata of this system would have greater motivation, and those who were closer to the top of this would see that risk reward question as much less favorable. They would tend to say, I'm fine where I'm at. You guys, good luck on that journey out there. And the people that were less Spanish were the ones that were more likely to do this particular job on behalf of the Spanish. That's a really important twist. And one of the texts that I want to share with you and that I want to encourage folks to explore in more detail before we gather in January again is this. It's really a short book. It's kind of like a pamphlet about 30 pages long by a researcher that was, I believe, in graduate school at UC Berkeley at the time, Damini Fisher. He wrote this book about the Afro-Latino presence in early California, and it is quite interesting in that it includes a lot of primary source documents, let me just click on this and open the PDF. If you, the PDF which Mr. Fisher gave me his full permission and support for sharing, has an awful lot of images like those I've showed you so far that I think are great for analysis and discussion by students. But the information in here is also excellent and really um, diversifies the story that might be forming in students' heads as they think about and learn about colonization of North America. They might be envisioning Spanish people moving across the landscape, Spanish people in contact with the indigenous tribes they encountered, these rugged landscapes. But what they might not expect is that the actual composition of the expedition itself looks a lot like a diverse group of school students or teachers and the students at a middle or high school in California today. So this book is excellent to explore and is yours to investigate more deeply. I'll also say that in the story map itself, if we click over to the story map, and we look at this community on the move, you can see that paragraph of information I just shared or those bullet points. And it asks the question, why would this be an especially important location to have a permanent settlement, right? We've talked about the group moving. We haven't quite talked yet about the destination. So let's see if I'll do the like a reverse Q&A where I'll ask the Q and see if anybody's got the A to enter into the Q&A. So why do you think the expedition was targeting the San Francisco Peninsula or the Bay Area for a settlement? Labeled here on this map as the Port San Francisco, St. Francis Drake, not San Francisco. Any thoughts about that? Whoops, going back here. Well, here's what had happened during the explorations. The Spanish realized that the coast of California didn't include very many safe ports. So it was very difficult for them to colonize that coastline by virtue of ship travel. The ships were facing really risky conditions, and the kind of reliability of delivering people and goods to the shoreline was low. Actually, I live in the San Diego area, and ships aiming for San Diego used to quite frequently only realize they had missed San Diego when they determined they were at Point Concepcion. And then they had to decide whether to turn back and try and find San Diego or continue on to San Francisco. So the ship travel had been difficult, but ships had gotten into San Francisco Bay on multiple occasions, and parties had landed on the peninsula, and they had studied the movement of water in and out of the mouth of the Golden Gate, the entry between the connection between the Pacific Ocean and San Francisco Bay. And the notes they made and the observations they made led them to believe that they were looking at the mouth of a large river system. And so they thought, much like had happened for the French in the Mississippi River system, that the Spanish might be learning about and identifying a particular bit of territory that would be extremely valuable for their territorial expansion. Because a river system would give them access to interior resources, interior lands, and it would make it possible for them to cash in the way that all colonial expansion was supposed to and was hoped to. So that is why they were targeting there. Oh, I can't unmute. We will we'll figure that out for part two. I'm sure there's a way for me to unmute you. Um, but with 14 minutes to go, let me just point out a couple more things, and then I'll stick around after I wrap up, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, and I will see if there's a way for me to unmute people through the Q&A portal there. The Park Service also has some really interesting information that you can access to kind of visualize the members of the expedition, to get an idea what it would have looked like to see people on the trail, the different kinds of individuals who would have been making the journey and surviving the elements to start a new life. So it's interesting to get into that. And then you can also see the complete list of expedition members, the full rundown, and kind of what their position was, their age, and then often something about what happened in their life in California after this journey. There's also kind of an interesting interactive for elementary and middle school students. I think it would be interesting for them to use this Junior Rangers interface, where students are able to, just like we have diaries for the journey from Font and Garces and de Anza, this gives the students an opportunity to explore the experiences of kind of regular settler participants in the expedition, and to make kind of a choose your own adventure experience. So there's lots of things in here that you can explore. I mentioned the Dominique Fisher book that you can access, the diaries. We'll also talk about some of these maps about commemorating the route in part 3, but just wanted to get down to the media section. So there are videos here that are produced by the national park, produced by other um, friends of the Anza National Historic Trail. So they represent many different perspectives, native perspectives. There are some that are more designed around the experience of being on the trail, and some that put the trail development in historical context. So just to know that there's a lot of stuff in here, including recordings of native languages and nature sounds that people would have heard along the trail, a song, a 10-minute corrido that tells the story of the Anza expedition in song. Lots of cool stuff. Okay, I think that's the end of what I have to present to you today. There's a lot more to present in sessions 2 and 3. You can always email me questions at either one of my email addresses. And thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully, I will see you at the 2 upcoming sessions where we'll be far along the trail in January, and then picking out the perfect place for a settlement on March 25th. Thank you. We will be exploring the issue in part 3, specifically about the commemoration of Anza's contribution on the landscape. And I think you're right to say Sarah has um, left his name and his impression in more places than Anza. Okay, thanks everybody. See you in January.